Something shifted in the order of the world this week, and for once, the shift did not originate from Washington. It came from Davos, from a Canadian Prime Minister who stood before the global elite and declared that the post-war international system, the system the United States built and maintained for 8 decades, is over. Not transitioning, not evolving, over. Mark Carney did not mention Donald Trump by name. He did not have to. Everyone in the room understood exactly who he was talking about. And everyone understood that Canada, America's closest ally and largest trading partner, was drawing a line. The response from Washington arrived within hours. Trump posted on social media that Canada lives because of the United States. He threatened 100% tariffs. He revoked Canada's invitation to his Board of Peace initiative. He called the sitting prime minister of a sovereign nation, Governor Carney, the same insulting nickname he once used for Justin Trudeau when suggesting Canada should become the 51st state. And then, when Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent claimed Carney had walked back his Davos remarks during a private phone call with Trump, Carney went before reporters in Ottawa and delivered a 3-word response that will define this confrontation going forward. I meant what I said. The standoff between Washington and Ottawa is no longer a disagreement between allies. It is a structural fracture in the most successful trade relationship in modern history. And what makes it dangerous is not the rhetoric. What makes it dangerous is the numbers underneath. To understand why Carney's speech mattered, you first need to understand what it actually said. The address was delivered on January 20th, 2026, at the World Economic Forum, the annual gathering of heads of state, corporate executives, and financial elites in the Swiss Alps. Carney spoke for approximately 30 minutes. When he finished, he received something unusual for a Davos address: a standing ovation. The core argument was direct. For decades, Carney said, countries like Canada prospered under what we called the rules-based international order. We joined its institutions. We praised its principles. We benefited from its predictability. But that order, he argued, was always partially a fiction. The strongest exempted themselves when convenient. Trade rules were enforced asymmetrically. International law applied with varying rigor, depending on the identity of the accused. Carney's point was not that the system had been perfect. His point was that the system had at least provided structure. It had provided predictability. It had allowed smaller nations to pursue values-based foreign policies under the protection of shared institutions. And now, he said, that protection is gone. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. The language was deliberate. Great powers, Carney said, have begun using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. He invoked the Czech dissident Václav Havel's concept of living within a lie, the danger of continuing to pretend that systems function when everyone knows they do not. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration, Carney said, when integration becomes the source of your subordination. And then came the line that will define this moment in Canadian foreign policy history. Middle powers must act together, because if we are not at the table, we are on the menu. This was a declaration of strategic autonomy. This was a Canadian Prime Minister telling the world that his country would no longer organize its foreign policy around the assumption that the United States would remain a reliable partner. This was Carney announcing that Canada would build coalitions, diversify trade, and develop the capacity to withstand pressure from its most powerful neighbor. The old order is not coming back, he said. We should not mourn it. Nostalgia is not a strategy. The timing of the speech was not accidental. Just days earlier, Carney had returned from Beijing, where he had signed a trade agreement that would allow up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into Canada annually at a reduced tariff rate of 6.1%. Down from 100%. In exchange, China agreed to lower tariffs on Canadian agricultural exports, including canola seed oil, which had been facing duties as high as 85%. The deal also included Canadian lobster, crab, peas, and pork. Carney characterized the arrangement as narrow, a sectoral adjustment to resolve recent trade tensions, not a free trade agreement, not a strategic realignment. Just a practical deal that would benefit Canadian farmers and give Canadian consumers access to more affordable electric vehicles. The Chinese would also be expected to invest in Canadian automotive manufacturing within 3 years. But the Trump administration saw something else. They saw a back door. They saw Canada opening a pathway for Chinese goods to flow into North America, potentially bypassing American tariffs through transshipment. They saw a deliberate provocation. Trump's initial reaction to the Canada-China deal had actually been measured. Days before Davos, he had said the agreement was what Carney should be doing, and that it was good for him to sign a trade deal. Treasury Secretary Bessent had made similar comments, but the Davos speech changed everything. Carney had not just signed a deal with China, he had framed that deal as part of a broader strategy to reduce Canadian dependence on the United States. He had called for middle powers to unite against great power coercion. He had declared the American-led order dead. On Saturday, January 25th, Trump posted on Truth Social that if Governor Carney thinks he is going to make Canada a drop-off port for China to send goods and products into the United States, he is sorely mistaken. He threatened 100% tariffs on all Canadian imports if Canada pursued a trade deal with Beijing. He posted that China is successfully and completely taking over the once great country of Canada. He expressed hope that the Chinese would at least leave ice hockey alone. The rhetoric intensified over the following days. Trump posted an altered image showing a map of the United States that included Canada, Venezuela, Greenland, and Cuba as American territory. He accused Carney of showing ingratitude despite getting a lot of freebies from us. He rescinded Canada's invitation to join his Board of Peace, and then, on Thursday, January 30th, he went further. He threatened a 50% tariff on all aircraft sold by Canada to the United States, specifically targeting Bombardier, Quebec's largest aircraft manufacturer. The aircraft threat was presented as retaliation. Trump claimed Canada had refused to certify Gulfstream jets from Georgia. He announced he would decertify all Canadian aircraft in response. The escalation was rapid, and it was deliberate. Throughout this barrage, Carney held his position. On Sunday, he clarified that Canada had no intention of pursuing a full free trade agreement with China or any other non-market economy. He pointed out that the deal was entirely consistent with the terms of the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, which requires notification before any such comprehensive arrangement. But he did not apologize. He did not soften his tone. And when Bessent claimed on Fox News that Carney had very aggressively walked back his Davos remarks during a private call with Trump, Carney went before reporters and issued a correction. To be absolutely clear, and I said this to the president, I meant what I said in Davos. He then added something else. He told Trump about the 12 new trade deals Canada had signed on 4 continents in 6 months. He said the president was impressed. This is where the confrontation stops being about rhetoric and starts being about leverage. And the leverage does not favor Washington as cleanly as the White House appears to believe. Canada is the top export destination for 36 American states. Nearly $3.6 billion in goods and services cross the border every single day. The bilateral trade relationship is valued at approximately $2.7 billion daily. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of crude oil to the United States, accounting for roughly 60% of all American oil imports, more than 4 million barrels per day. The heavy crude from Alberta's oil sands feeds Midwest and Gulf Coast refineries that were specifically designed to process that grade of petroleum. These refineries cannot simply switch suppliers. The infrastructure is purpose-built. Canada supplies 85% of all electricity imported by the United States. It provides 99% of American natural gas imports. Canadian uranium fuels American nuclear reactors. Canadian aluminum and steel flow into American manufacturing. The energy trade alone was valued at approximately $151 billion in 2024. The integration runs so deep that unraveling it would not merely be expensive, it would be structurally disruptive. When Ontario briefly floated the idea of a 25% tariff on electricity exports to Michigan, Minnesota, and New York in response to earlier American tariffs, it sent a signal. Canada has tools, and some of those tools can impose pain on specific American states and specific American industries within days. The Trump administration's leverage comes from the upcoming review of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. The trade deal, negotiated during Trump's first term, includes a mandatory joint review in 2026, beginning this summer. Trump has called the agreement irrelevant. He has described it as transitional. During a meeting with Carney at the White House last October, he said the deal may have served its purpose. This is the context for every threat being issued from Washington. The review gives the administration a formal mechanism to renegotiate terms, to impose conditions, to extract concessions. And the implicit threat behind every tariff announcement is that failure to comply will result in the collapse of the framework that currently protects most Canadian exports from the harshest American duties. But Carney has reframed the negotiation. He is no longer positioning Canada as a junior partner seeking accommodation. He is positioning Canada as a middle power building alternatives. And he is doing so publicly, with the explicit message that Canada will diversify away from the United States regardless of what happens in the review. This is why the Davos speech mattered. It was not just criticism, it was a strategic declaration. Carney told the world that Canada's old relationship with the United States, a relationship based on steadily increasing integration, is over. He said Canada will need to dramatically reduce its reliance on the United States. He said Canada will need to pivot its trade relationships elsewhere. And then, he began doing exactly that. In the 6 months since taking office, Carney's government has signed 12 trade and security agreements across 4 continents. Deals with the European Union have deepened. Negotiations with India, with ASEAN, with the South American Mercosur bloc are advancing. The China arrangement, however limited, signals a willingness to engage with Beijing that would have been unthinkable under previous Canadian governments. The strategic logic is straightforward. A country that depends on a single trading partner for its prosperity has no leverage when that partner becomes hostile. Diversification is insurance, and insurance becomes more valuable when the threat becomes real. Carney described this as classic risk management. The cost of strategic autonomy, he said, can be shared. Collective investments in resilience are cheaper than everyone building their own fortress. But there is risk in this approach as well. Canada remains deeply integrated with the American economy. The diversification Carney is pursuing will take years to produce meaningful results. In the short term, the country remains vulnerable to exactly the kind of economic pressure Trump is threatening. And if the USMCA review collapses, if tariffs escalate, if the bilateral relationship deteriorates further, Canadian workers and businesses will feel the pain long before alternative markets can absorb the displaced trade. This is the calculation Carney is making. He is betting that the United States cannot afford a full rupture with Canada any more than Canada can afford a full rupture with the United States. He is betting that the mutual dependencies are too deep, the supply chains too entangled, the energy infrastructure too interconnected for either side to walk away without catastrophic costs. He is betting that Trump's threats are negotiating posture, not policy reality. The danger is that Trump may not see it that way. The administration has already demonstrated willingness to impose tariffs that damage American industries and American consumers in pursuit of broader political objectives. The logic of transactionalism, which Carney explicitly criticized in Davos, does not always follow traditional cost-benefit analysis. It follows dominance logic, and dominance logic says that smaller partners should submit. Carney is refusing to submit. He is telling the Canadian public and the international community that Canada will not be bullied. He is framing the confrontation as a test of whether middle powers can resist great power coercion, and he is asking other countries, explicitly, to join him. The coming months will determine whether this strategy succeeds or collapses. The USMCA review begins this summer. Trump has promised to be a strong negotiator. Carney has promised to defend Canadian interests. The gap between their positions appears vast, but the underlying reality has not changed. Nearly 4 million barrels of Canadian oil cross into the United States every day. American refineries depend on that supply. American states depend on Canadian electricity. American manufacturers depend on Canadian raw materials. And American consumers depend on the trade relationship that has kept goods flowing across the longest undefended border in the world for more than a century. If that relationship fractures, both sides will suffer. The question is, which side is prepared to absorb more pain in pursuit of its objectives? And the answer to that question is not yet clear. What is clear is that the rules have changed. Canada is no longer acting like a junior partner. It is acting like a nation that has decided its sovereignty matters more than its compliance. It is acting like a country that has concluded the old bargain no longer holds. The international reaction to this confrontation has been telling. European leaders, who have spent years navigating their own complicated relationship with the Trump administration, watched Carney's Davos speech with particular interest. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, speaking at the same forum, echoed similar themes about building European independence and accepting that geopolitical change is permanent. The message from Europe's capitals has been clear. Canada is not alone in questioning whether the American alliance can still be taken at face value. For the global South, the confrontation carries different implications. Countries that have long balanced between American and Chinese influence are watching to see whether middle powers can successfully resist pressure from Washington. If Canada, with all its advantages, its wealth, its resources, its geographic proximity, its decades of alliance membership, cannot maintain an independent foreign policy, what hope do smaller nations have? Carney invoked this explicitly. He called for variable geometry, different coalitions for different issues, partnerships based on shared values and interests rather than permanent alignment with a single hegemon. He called for middle powers to stop merely invoking the rules-based international order and start building something that actually functions. The historical parallel that haunts this moment is the transformation of American foreign policy after World War II. When the United States emerged as the dominant global power, it chose to build institutions rather than simply impose dominance. It created the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, NATO. It offered the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. It established a framework in which smaller allies could prosper under American protection while retaining their sovereignty. That framework is what Carney says has ruptured. The bargain, he argued, was always asymmetric, but it provided enough benefit to enough partners that the system held. Now, with great powers using economic tools as weapons, with tariffs deployed as leverage, with financial infrastructure weaponized for political purposes, the cost of participation has begun to exceed the benefit. The question facing Canada and every other middle power is what comes next. A world of fortresses, as Carney put it, would be poorer, more fragile, and less sustainable. But a world in which smaller nations simply submit to great power demands offers no path to prosperity either. The challenge is to find a third way: collective resilience, shared standards, complementary investment, security through coordination rather than dependence. Whether this vision is achievable remains uncertain. Building alternative trade relationships takes years. Reorienting supply chains requires massive capital investment. Developing strategic autonomy in energy, food, and critical minerals demands policy consistency across multiple government cycles. And all of this must happen while managing the immediate economic relationship with a hostile administration in Washington. Carney said it plainly. The powerful have their power, but we have something too. The capacity to stop pretending, to name reality, to build our strength at home, and to act together. Whether that capacity will be enough remains the open question, but the confrontation is real. The stakes are enormous, and the outcome will shape North American relations for a generation. The helicopters and the headlines will move on. The trade statistics will fluctuate. The tariff threats will escalate and recede. But the structural question Carney raised in Davos will not disappear. Can middle powers chart their own course when great powers abandon restraint? Can nations that have built their prosperity on integration survive when integration becomes subordination? Canada is about to find out, and the rest of the world is watching.